What happens when the life you planned ends at 58? Rebecca Anderson asked herself that question every morning for 6 months straight, staring at the empty side of the bed where David used to sleep. The answer never came, just silence and the slow creep of daylight across walls that suddenly felt too close. Portland in March meant rain. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee, gone cold laptop open to pages she'd been scrolling for 3 hours. Estate sales, antique auctions, the kind of distraction that didn't require thinking about the fact that retirement from teaching meant no more reason to set an alarm, no more lesson plans, no more small voices asking why the sky was blue. David's cancer had taken 10 months to finish what it started. The school board gave her early retirement with full benefits and a plaque that said 35 years of dedication. She kept the plaque in a drawer. The cursor blinked on a real estate auction site. Most of the listings looked the same: foreclosures in suburbs, fixer-uppers with foundation problems, commercial properties no one wanted. Then she scrolled past a photograph so dark and grainy it could have been taken with a disposable camera in a thunderstorm. The image showed a massive house, 3 stories tall, strangled by vines and shadows. Trees crowded around it like they were trying to pull it back into the earth. Westfield Estate, South Carolina, built 1897, sold as is. Buyer assumes all liability. Starting bid $12,000. Rebecca clicked on the listing. No interior photos. No property history beyond a single line: historic plantation estate requiring complete restoration. The asking price sat there like a dare. She'd spent more on the used Subaru parked in her driveway. Her hand moved to the bid button before her brain caught up. David's voice echoed from some conversation years ago, something he said when they were young and still believed in signs. When you feel pulled, Becca, follow it. She placed a bid, $17,500, nearly half her savings account. Then she closed the laptop and went to take a shower, because if she looked at what she'd just done, she'd talk herself out of it. The confirmation email arrived at 2 in the morning. Congratulations, you are the winning bidder. Rebecca read it 3 times in the dark phone screen, casting blue light across her face. No other bids had come in. Somewhere in South Carolina sat a 100-year-old house that no one else wanted, and now it belonged to her. Selling the Portland house took 4 weeks. The realtor kept saying what a great market it was, how lucky Rebecca was to get asking price on the first offer. Lucky. Rebecca packed 35 years into boxes: wedding photos, David's reading glasses, the quilt his mother made them, teaching awards she'd never hung up. Most of it went to Goodwill. She kept 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of photographs, and David's worn leather Bible with his handwriting in the margins. The Subaru's trunk barely closed. Rebecca stood in the driveway of the empty house at dawn, keys in her hand, wondering if this was what a nervous breakdown looked like from the outside. Then she got in the car and started driving east. 3 days on the road: Oregon to Idaho to Wyoming to Nebraska to Missouri to Tennessee to South Carolina. The landscape flattened and then swelled again. Cities thinned into towns that thinned into crossroads, rest stops and gas stations and motel rooms that all smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. Rebecca drove with the radio off, just the hum of tires on asphalt, and her own thoughts circling the same questions she couldn't answer. Oak Ridge, South Carolina, appeared on the GPS like an afterthought. population 720, according to a faded sign at the town line. One main street, a brick post office, a diner called Mabel's with pickup trucks angled in front, a church with white paint peeling off the steeple. Rebecca pulled into a gas station where a teenage boy in a Gamecock's cap pumped her gas and stared at her Oregon plates like she'd driven in from another planet. "You lost. I bought the Westfield estate." His expression shifted. Not quite alarm, but something adjacent to it. "You mean the old plantation house out on Hatcher Road?" "That's the one." He finished pumping, took her cash, didn't offer change from a 20, even though the total was $16. "People don't usually stay out there long." Rebecca drove away before he could explain what that meant. Hatcher Road turned from pavement to gravel after 2 miles. Oak trees formed a canopy overhead, branches twisted together like arthritic fingers. The GPS lost signal. She followed the road by instinct, and the ruts worn into the dirt. The gate appeared suddenly. Wrought iron rusted orange-brown with the word Westfield worked into the metalwork at the top. The gate stood open, hanging crooked on hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades. Rebecca eased the Subaru through and onto a driveway that disappeared into dense woods. A mile of trees, maybe more. The road curved and climbed and then dropped into a clearing, and there it stood. Westfield Estate. 3 stories of weathered wood and peeling paint. Columns that might have been white once now gray with rot and moss. Windows boarded over or broken glass teeth catching the late afternoon sun. The whole structure leaned slightly to the left, like it had been exhaling for 100 years, and finally lost the strength to stand straight. Vines covered everything, wisteria and kudzu climbing the walls, wrapping around the porch railings, threading through broken shutters. Rebecca cut the engine. The silence hit her first. No birds, no wind, just the settling tick of the cooling car engine and the weight of the house watching. She climbed out. Her boots crunched on gravel, and broken oyster shells scattered across the drive. The porch steps groaned under her weight. The front door stood ajar, swollen in its frame, held shut by nothing but time and humidity. Rebecca pushed. The door gave with a shriek of old hinges. Inside, the air smelled like mildew and rotting wood, and something else, old fabric maybe, or paper gone to dust. The foyer stretched up 2 stories. A chandelier hung from the ceiling crystals, dulled by decades of cobwebs. The staircase curved along the left wall banister, carved with details she could barely make out under layers of grime. She set her suitcase down on warped floorboards. Then she stood in the center of what used to be someone's grand entrance and felt the full weight of her own foolishness settle on her shoulders. This wasn't a house. This was a mausoleum, and she'd just bought it with money she couldn't afford to lose. That night, Rebecca unrolled her sleeping bag in the center of the foyer because the upstairs felt too far away and too dark. She had a flashlight, a battery-powered lantern, and a bottle of water. No electricity, no running water. The house groaned around her like a ship settling into deep water. Boards creaked. Something scurried in the walls, rats probably, or squirrels. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, tracing water stains in the beam of her flashlight. David would have loved this. Not the decay, but the challenge of it. He'd always been the one who saw potential where Rebecca saw work. She'd been the practical one, the planner, the person who read instruction manuals and checked reviews before buying a toaster. And yet here she was, 58 years old, sleeping on the floor of a haunted plantation house she'd bought on impulse from 3,000 miles away. Around midnight, she heard it, faint at first, almost under the threshold of sound. Music, a melody so delicate it might have been her imagination. Rebecca sat up, heart suddenly loud in her ears. The music continued, a tinkling music box sound coming from somewhere above. She grabbed the flashlight and stood. Every reasonable instinct said to stay put, to wait until morning. But the melody pulled at something in her memory. She'd heard it before, somewhere, a long time ago. The staircase creaked with each step. Rebecca climbed slowly, flashlight beams sweeping across peeling wallpaper and exposed lath. The second-floor hallway stretched into darkness. Doors hung open on either side, revealing empty rooms with collapsed ceilings and water-rotted floors. The music grew louder. Last door on the right. Rebecca pushed it open. The room inside was smaller than the others. A servant's room, maybe. No furniture except a single wooden crate turned on its side in the corner. And sitting on top of the crate, covered in dust, but somehow pristine underneath, sat a music box. The lid stood open. The mechanism, inside, still turned cylinder, rotating against tiny metal teeth, producing that impossible melody. Rebecca approached slowly. The music box was oval-shaped, made of dark wood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Beautiful, delicate, and it shouldn't have been working at all. She reached out and closed the lid. The music stopped. In the silence that followed, Rebecca realized she was shaking, not from fear, from recognition. Her grandmother used to hum that tune. Rebecca remembered falling asleep to it as a child, the wordless melody floating through the farmhouse in eastern Washington, where her grandmother had lived alone after Rebecca's grandfather died. She'd asked once what the song was called. Her grandmother had smiled and said, "Just an old tune from when I was young." Rebecca opened the music box again. The melody resumed, and this time she hummed along, finding the notes perfectly. How did this music box in this abandoned house in South Carolina play the same song her grandmother had hummed 40 years ago in Washington? She picked up the music box carefully. Underneath it, carved into the wooden crate, someone had scratched words. Rebecca angled the flashlight. "For Eleanor. May she remember joy." Eleanor. Rebecca's grandmother's name had been Margaret, but her middle name, the one she never used, had been Eleanor, sir. Rebecca carried the music box downstairs. She set it on the floor next to her sleeping bag and lay awake until dawn, listening to the melody play over and over until the mechanism finally wound down and stopped. Morning light revealed details she'd missed in the dark. Rebecca walked through the first-floor room by room, documenting the damage. Kitchen cabinets rotted through floors, sagging a cast-iron stove crusted with rust. Parlor collapsed ceiling, water damage, wallpaper hanging in strips. Dining room surprisingly intact with a long table still standing and chairs pushed back as if everyone had just stood up and walked away. In the back hallway, she found something that stopped her cold. Carved into the doorframe, barely visible under layers of old white paint, were symbols. Not words, symbols. Crosses and circles and zigzag lines cut deep into the wood with a knife or chisel. Protection marks. Rebecca's grandmother had drawn the same symbols in salt on her doorstep every New Year. Folklore from the old days, she'd said, keeps out bad spirits and bad luck. Rebecca knelt and scraped at the paint with her thumbnail. More symbols emerged. Then, at the very bottom of the frame, letters. She worked carefully, peeling away paint in thin strips. E.M. 1916. Her breath caught. Eleanor M. 1916. 8 years before Rebecca's mother was born. 60 years before Rebecca was born. But Eleanor or Mitchell? Margaret? Eleanor Mitchell. Her grandmother had been here, in this house, had carved her initials into this doorframe 108 years ago. Rebecca sat back on her heels. The impossible started arranging itself into something that resembled logic. The music box, the melody, the symbols, her grandmother's middle name. The pieces didn't quite fit yet, but they were trying to. She needed answers, the kind that came from church records and county archives and old people with long memories. Oak Ridge Baptist Church sat on Main Street, next to the post office. White clapboard siding, red door. A sign out front listed service times and a phone number. Rebecca parked and climbed the steps. The door opened to a small vestibule that smelled like old hymnals and lemon furniture polish. "Help you!" The voice came from a man in his 70s, tall and thin, wearing slacks and a cardigan despite the warmth. Wire-rimmed glasses, gentle face with deep smile lines. "I'm looking for historical records, baptisms, marriages, from the early 1900s. He studied her for a moment. "You're the woman who bought Westfield." News travels fast. Town this size, news travels at the speed of sound. He extended his hand. "George White. I'm the pastor here. Been keeping the books for 40 years. They shook. His grip was firm but careful, like he knew his own strength and chose not to use it. "Rebecca Anderson. I'm trying to find information about someone who might have lived at the estate. A woman named Eleanor Mitchell." George's expression shifted, not quite surprise, more like recognition. "Mitchell. That name's in our records. Come on back." He led her through the sanctuary, simple wooden pews, a plain cross on the wall behind the altar, and into a small office lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. George pulled a leather-bound ledger from a shelf and set it on the desk. "Baptism records. We've got entries going back to 1872, when this church was founded." He opened the book carefully, pages yellowed and fragile. His finger traced down columns of names and dates written in fading ink. "Here, Eleanor Mitchell, baptized April 14th, 1901, age 11. Rebecca leaned in. The handwriting was spidery and formal. "Eleanor Mitchell, born say 1890, parents Ruth Hayes, Mitchell and James Mitchell, deceased. Servant Westfield Plantation." Servant. The word sat heavy in the room. George closed the book gently. This was a plantation, Mrs. Anderson, before emancipation and after. The Westfield family, originally called the Harrison family. They changed it around 1890. They owned this land and the people who worked it. After slavery ended, many stayed on as paid laborers. Though paid is generous, they were trapped by debt and nowhere else to go. What happened to the Harrison family? That's where the history gets murky. They left in 1918. Suddenly. No announcement, no forwarding address. Just gone. The plantation sat empty for years. Eventually reverted to the county. Been bought and sold a few times since, but nobody ever stayed. People say it's cursed. He gave her a sad smile. "I don't believe in curses, but I believe in history, and this plantation has a history that most folks would rather forget." Rebecca touched the page where Eleanor's name was written. "My grandmother's middle name was Eleanor. Her maiden name was Mitchell. She was born in 1924 in Seattle, but she never talked about where her family came from before that." George looked at her over his glasses. "You think there's a connection?" "I found something in the house. A music box, and initials carved into a doorframe. E.M. 1916. "Then you're looking at the same woman. Eleanor Mitchell would have been 26 in 1916. Why would my grandmother never mention this? Why Seattle? Why the silence?" George was quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Anderson. People who escaped places like Westfield didn't talk about them. They buried those years deep and built new lives on top. If your grandmother came from here, she had reasons for keeping it quiet, reasons I suspect you're about to discover. Rebecca spent the rest of the afternoon searching the church records. She found Eleanor's parents, Ruth and James Mitchell, both listed as servants at Westfield. James died in 1905. Ruth appeared in records until 1917, then vanished. No death certificate, no grave marker in the colored section of the cemetery George showed her. Just absence where a person used to be. She drove back to Westfield as the sun dropped below the tree line. The house looked different in the fading light, less abandoned, more watchful. Rebecca carried her flashlight and a crowbar she'd bought at the hardware store in town. If there were answers here, she was going to find them. The servants' quarters were in the back of the first floor, 4 small rooms each, barely 10 feet square, with low ceilings and narrow windows. Rebecca had glanced at them that morning, but hadn't searched thoroughly. Now she went room by room, pulling up loose floorboards, checking behind peeling wallpaper, looking for spaces that didn't match the dimensions. The third room had floors that flexed under her weight. Rebecca knelt and pressed each board, listening for hollow sounds. In the far corner, one board rocked when she stepped on it. She wedged the crowbar underneath and pried. The board came up easily. Underneath, in the space between the floor joists, sat a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Rebecca's hands trembled as she lifted it out. The cloth crumbled at her touch, revealing a tin box about the size of a shoebox, secured with a simple latch. She sat on the floor and opened it. Inside letters, dozens of them yellowed with age, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Rebecca untied the ribbon carefully and unfolded the top letter. The handwriting was precise and small, cramped by the need to fit as much as possible on each precious piece of paper. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still legible. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "you are 3 months old. You will never read this letter because you will never know I existed. But I write it anyway because a mother should leave something for her daughter, even if it is only words." Rebecca's vision blurred. Margaret, her mother's name. She read on. "Your grandmother Ruth is taking you north tomorrow, to Seattle, to safety, to a life I can never give you. I have sewn money into the lining of your blanket, enough for Ruth to start over, enough for you to grow up free from this place." The letter continued detailing Eleanor's life at Westfield, the hours 4 in the morning until 9 at night, the work, cooking, cleaning, serving, mending, washing, the rules: no reading, no sitting, no speaking unless spoken to, the punishments for small infractions, the constant, grinding weight of being owned in everything but legal name. "I am 27 years old," Eleanor wrote. "I have spent 17 years in this house, but I will not die here, and you will never set foot in it. This is my gift to you, Margaret. Freedom, even if it means I never hold you again." Rebecca set the letter down and picked up the next one, and the next. Eleanor had written dozens, one every few weeks, addressed to a daughter who would never receive them. The letters spanned from March 1918 to May 1918. They told the story of a woman preparing for something, organizing, planning. May 15th, 1918. One letter began, "Daniel Freeman says we have 40 ready. We meet in the tobacco barn after midnight. We are planning something I cannot write in detail here, but I am not afraid any more, Margaret. I am awake." The letters grew shorter, more urgent. The last one was dated June 2nd, 1918. Tomorrow. We act tomorrow. Not with violence, we are not them, but with truth and numbers and the refusal to disappear quietly. If this succeeds, the Harrisons will leave. If it fails, I will likely die here. Either way, you are safe in Seattle. You are free. That is enough. That is everything. Rebecca read the letter 3 times. Then she set it down and looked back into the tin box. One more item remained at the bottom, a photograph. She lifted it carefully. The image was sepia-toned, edges worn. It showed a group of people standing in front of Westfield Estate. The house looked pristine in the photo, fresh paint, intact shutters, manicured grounds. In the foreground stood a white family, a man in a suit, a woman in a long dress, 2 children. Behind them, arranged in a careful line, stood 20 or so black men and women in plain work clothes. Rebecca's eyes went to the young woman standing third from the left in the back row. She was small, thin, with her hair pulled back tight. Her face was serious, unsmiling, and unmistakable. She looked exactly like the photographs Rebecca had of her grandmother Margaret at age 25. Same bone structure, same set to the jaw, same eyes. Rebecca turned the photograph over. Written on the back in the same careful handwriting as the letters Eleanor Mitchell, age 24, Westfield Estate, 1915. The room tilted. Rebecca braced herself against the floor, breathing hard. This wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't coincidence. Eleanor Mitchell, the woman who carved protection symbols into door frames, who wrote letters to a daughter she'd never see again, who organized some kind of uprising against the family that owned her labor, was her great-grandmother. Her grandmother Margaret had been born here, in this house, and had been taken away at 3 months old by Ruth Ellen Orr's mother to Seattle. Margaret grew up believing she was an orphan, that her mother had died in childbirth, that her grandmother Ruth was all the family she had. She'd married young, had Rebecca's mother, in 1948, died in 1982, never knowing the truth about where she came from. And Eleanor. What happened to Eleanor? The letters stopped June 2nd. The Harrisons left June 4th, according to George. Did Eleanor survive? Did she escape? Did she die here? Rebecca sat on the floor of the servants' quarters until the flashlight battery died and the room went dark. The music box melody played in her head, endless and aching. She thought about her grandmother, humming that tune, never knowing it came from a mother she'd been too young to remember, never knowing she'd been saved by a woman who chose to stay and fight instead of run. In the darkness, Rebecca made a decision. She would find out what happened in June 1918. She would find Eleanor's story, and she would make sure it was told. Outside, the South Carolina night pressed against the windows. The house settled around her with creaks and whispers. And in Rebecca's hands, the photograph of Eleanor Mitchell stared up at the ceiling where somewhere above a music box sat silent, holding the memory of joy in a place built on suffering. The past was not dead. It was not even past. It was carved into door frames and hidden under floorboards and written in letters that had waited 106 years to be found. Rebecca Anderson had come to Westfield looking for a project to fill her empty days. She'd found a legacy instead, and she was not leaving until she understood every word of it. Rebecca spent the next week living in a kind of fever. She bought a Coleman stove bottled water by the case, a battery pack to charge her phone. The Oak Ridge hardware store started keeping a running tab. She worked from sunrise until the flashlight batteries died, documenting everything, photographing rooms, measuring dimensions, making lists of what needed repair and what was already lost. But the real work happened at the church. George White opened the archive room for her every morning at 8. Tax records, census data, property deeds, marriage licenses, death certificates, the paper trail of lives sieved and ended in Oak Ridge and the surrounding county. Rebecca sat at the long table under fluorescent lights and traced her family backward through time. Census 1920. No Eleanor Mitchell, no Ruth Mitchell. Both names simply vanished from the records as if they'd never existed. Census 1910. Ruth Hayes Mitchell, age 38 servant. Eleanor Mitchell, age 20 servant. Both living at Westfield Plantation. Employer Harrison James R. Census, 1900. Ruth Hayes, age 28, unmarried servant. Daughter Eleanor, age 10. James Mitchell, listed separately as laborer, married to Ruth that same year according to a faded marriage certificate Rebecca found in a different folder. The Harrisons appeared in every census from 1880 to 1910. James R. Harrison, born 1855, in Charleston. Wife Caroline, born 1862. Two sons, James Jr. and Robert. The family owned 847 acres, grew cotton and tobacco, employed the census, used that word employed between 40 and 60 workers depending on the season. Then, 1920. The Harrison family disappeared from the census entirely. The property was listed as unoccupied ownership disputed. Rebecca looked up from the ledger. George sat across from her, reading glasses perched on his nose, working through a stack of parish records. The 1920 census says ownership disputed. What does that mean? George set down his pen. Means there was a legal question about who owned Westfield. Happens sometimes when families leave suddenly. Creditors come calling. Heirs fight over the estate. But in this case, he pulled a thin file from the cabinet behind him. There's something stranger. He opened the file. Inside were newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, from the Oak Ridge Observer. Most were mundane harvest reports, church socials, advertisements for patent medicines. Then George pointed to a gap in the dates. June through August, 1918. 12 weeks of newspapers, all missing from the archive. Missing how lost? Not lost. Removed. Someone went through the bound volumes and cut out every page from those months. Did it carefully with a razor. Left the margins so you wouldn't notice unless you were looking. Rebecca leaned closer. The cut edges were clean deliberate. Someone didn't want those weeks on record. That's what I think. But there's one piece that survived. George pulled a single clipping from the back of the file. This was stuck inside a hymnal in the church library. I found it 5 years ago and didn't know what to make of it. The clipping was from the Charlotte Observer, dated July 6, 1918. Just a few paragraphs under a small headline, "Labor Dispute at Oak Ridge Plantation Ends Quietly." Rebecca read it twice. The article mentioned Westfield by the old name Harrison Estate, said there had been a disagreement between the property owner and agricultural workers that was resolved to mutual satisfaction without intervention from authorities. A James Harrison and family had chosen to relocate to Charleston to pursue other business interests. The plantation would be managed by a community trust pending future disposition. Community trust. Rebecca looked up. The same words from the census. Right, but no details about what that meant, and the Observer never followed up. After this, nothing. The Harrisons vanished from public record. The plantation sat empty, and the people who worked there— George spread his hands. They scattered. Most left South Carolina entirely. The ones who stayed didn't talk because they were afraid, or because they'd been warned, or because some things are better left buried. George took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Mrs. Anderson, whatever happened in June 1918 changed everything. The Harrisons were powerful people, wealthy, connected. They didn't just walk away from 800 acres because of a labor dispute. Something forced their hand. Rebecca thought about Eleanor's letters, the careful planning, the meetings in the tobacco barn, 40 people ready to act. What if the workers organized? What if they threatened to go public with something the Harrisons couldn't afford to have known? Like what? Like how they treated the people who worked for them, like violence or theft or— Rebecca stopped. The pieces were there, but she couldn't quite fit them together yet. I need to find Eleanor's journal. The letters mentioned she was keeping a record. She called it her truth. George nodded slowly. If she kept it, she would have hidden it well. Somewhere the Harrisons wouldn't look. Somewhere it could survive. That afternoon, Rebecca went back to Westfield with a new purpose. She'd searched the servant quarters and found the letters. But a journal was different, more dangerous if discovered. Eleanor would have hidden it somewhere harder to reach. The attic was accessed by a narrow staircase off the second-floor hallway. Rebecca had avoided it so far because the stairs looked half-rotted. Now she climbed carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight down. The attic door stood open, hanging by one hinge. Inside, the space stretched the full length of the house. Low ceiling, exposed beams. The heat was suffocating even in March. Rebecca's flashlight beam cut through dust thick enough to taste. Old furniture sat in clusters, broken chairs, a warped dresser, steamer trunks with rusted locks. She worked methodically, opening trunks, checking drawers, looking under floorboards that flexed and cracked beneath her boots. Most of what she found was junk, moth-eaten curtains, cracked dishes wrapped in newspaper from the 1930s, a child's rocking horse with one runner missing. Then she noticed the chimney. It ran up through the center of the attic brick, darkened by a century of smoke. Rebecca approached it, running her hands over the rough surface. About 5 feet up, one brick sat slightly proud of the others. She pressed it. Nothing happened. She tried pulling. The brick slid out, revealing a cavity behind. Rebecca reached into the hole. Her fingers touched something wrapped in cloth. She pulled it out carefully. The cloth was oilskin, stiff with age. Inside was a small book, bound in leather, no bigger than her hand. The cover was blank. Rebecca opened it to the first page. Record of Eleanor M. The handwriting matched the letters exactly. Below that, begun April 1915. God witness what is written here. Rebecca sat down on a trunk and began to read. The first entries were short, observations about daily life at Westfield, the hours worked, the tasks assigned. Small rebellions, Eleanor teaching herself to read from books she found in the trash, memorizing scripture she heard from the white folks' Sunday services, saving pennies hidden in a tin buried behind the kitchen. April 2nd, 1915. I am 25 years old. I have lived in this house since I was 8 years old. I will not die here. Whatever comes, I will not die in this place where my mother still scrubs floors and my father is 6 years in the ground from a timber accident they said was his own fault for not paying attention. I will not die here. The entries grew longer, more detailed. Eleanor wrote about Daniel Freeman, a field hand 10 years older who'd learned to read from a traveling preacher. Daniel started meeting with small groups after dark, talking about rights and dignity and the ways black communities up north were organizing. December 1917. Daniel says we have 40 ready, people who will stand together. We plan for spring when the planting is done and the Harrisons need us most. Not violence, never violence. They want us to be violent so they can call us criminals. We will be calm. We will be organized. We will tell them the truth they don't want to hear. Rebecca's hands shook as she turned the pages. This wasn't just resistance. This was strategy. Eleanor documented everything. Names of workers willing to participate, records of unpaid wages, instances of physical punishment, a detailed account of a woman named Sarah who was beaten so badly for breaking a plate that she lost vision in one eye. May 1918. My baby girl is safe with Mama Ruth. She left yesterday for Charleston, then a train north. Seattle Daniel's cousin says, far enough, they'll never find her. I held Margaret for 1 hour, memorized her face. Then I let her go because a mother's first job is to save her child from her own life. I will never hold her again, but she will be free. She will grow up not knowing the weight of this place. That is my gift to her. Rebecca read that entry 3 times, tears blurring the words. Eleanor had given up her daughter weeks before the confrontation, sent her away with Ruth, knowing she might not survive what came next, chose to stay and fight instead of run with her child to safety. The journal entries became daily reports as June approached. On June 1st, Eleanor wrote that Daniel had called a meeting for the next night. Everyone was ready. They had a list of demands: fair wages, an end to physical punishment, basic medical care, written contracts. And they had leverage, a detailed record of Harrison's violations of labor laws signed by witnesses ready to be sent to the Justice Department and every newspaper in the state if the Harrisons refused. June 3rd, 1918. Tonight, we meet at midnight in the gathering room beneath the library. 41 of us. Daniel will speak for us. I will stand with him. Whatever happens, we face it together. No violence, just truth and numbers and the refusal to disappear quietly. I am not afraid. Fear is what they counted on. We are done being afraid. The entry ended there. Rebecca flipped to the next page, but it was blank. Then the page after that. The journal was only half full. The rest was empty, as if Eleanor had run out of words or time or both. Rebecca closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. The past 48 hours rearranged themselves in her mind. The letters, the photograph, the census records, now this. Her great-grandmother had been part of an organized uprising, not violent, not chaotic, planned and purposeful. And it had succeeded somehow because the Harrisons left and the workers stayed. But what happened after June 3rd? Where was Eleanor now? She needed to talk to someone who knew the local history beyond what was written in official records. Someone who'd heard the stories passed down through families. Someone who'd lived long enough to remember when the memories were still fresh. Rebecca found Shirley Allen's address in the church directory George had given her. The house sat 3 blocks off Main Street, a small brick ranch with flower boxes under the windows and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. Rebecca knocked. The woman who answered was barely 5 feet tall, skin like polished walnut hair, white and pulled back in a neat bun. She looked at Rebecca with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You're the one bought Westfield." "Rebecca Anderson. Are you Shirley Allen?" "I am, and I've been wondering when you'd come asking questions." She stepped back. "Might as well come in." The living room was tidy and cluttered at the same time, doilies on every surface, photographs covering one entire wall, a china cabinet full of teacups. Shirley gestured to a floral couch. "Sit, I'll make tea." "You don't have to. I'm making tea because I want tea, and you look like you need some." Shirley disappeared into the kitchen. Rebecca sat and studied the photographs, black and white images from different eras, young people in military uniforms, wedding photos, school pictures. One frame held a very old photograph of a young black woman in a plain dress standing in front of a wooden building. Shirley returned with 2 cups on a tray. She handed one to Rebecca and settled into an armchair that had clearly been hers for decades. "That's my grandmother, Lucille Allen, taken in 1916. Shirley pointed to the photograph Rebecca had been examining. "She worked at Westfield, laundry and mending mostly. She was there the night everything changed." Rebecca set down her cup before her shaking hands could spill it. "June 3rd, 1918. You've been reading." Shirley sipped her tea, watching Rebecca over the rim. "Found Eleanor's journal, did you? You knew about it?" "Not where it was, but I knew Eleanor kept records. My grandmother told me. She said Eleanor was the bravest woman she'd ever known, brave enough to document everything, even though she'd be killed if they found out. Brave enough to give up her baby so the baby could live free. Brave enough to stand with Daniel Freeman and face down people who thought they owned her." Rebecca leaned forward. "What happened that night?" Shirley set her cup down carefully. "What did the journal tell you?" "It stopped on June 3rd, right before the meeting." "Then I'll tell you what my grandmother told me. But first you need to understand something, Mrs. Anderson. This story has been kept quiet for 106 years, not because people forgot, because they chose not to speak it out loud where the wrong ears might hear. You asking me to break that silence." "I'm Eleanor's great-granddaughter." Shirley's eyebrows rose. "Are you now?" Rebecca pulled out her phone and showed the photograph she'd taken of Eleanor's picture. Then a photo of her own grandmother, Margaret, at age 25. The resemblance was undeniable. Shirley studied both images for a long moment. Then she nodded. "All right, your blood gives you the right. I'll tell you what I know." She settled back in her chair. June 3rd, 1918. 41 workers gathered in a hidden room beneath the library. That room exists, by the way. You'll need to find it if you haven't already. They'd been planning for months. Daniel Freeman had connections up north, NAACP, labor organizers, journalists. They had documentation of every violation, every assault, every unpaid wage, every time the Harrisons broke the law. And they threatened to go public. More than threatened. Daniel had already sent copies to 3 newspapers and the Justice Department. Set up a dead man switch, my grandmother called it. If anything happened to the workers, if they got arrested or hurt or killed, those documents would be published, and the Harrisons would face federal investigation. Rebecca felt something click into place. So the Harrisons had no choice. They had 2 choices: sign over the property and leave quietly, or face exposure and possible prison. They chose to leave. Shirley picked up her tea again. June 4th, 1918. James Harrison signed a deed transferring Westfield to the Oak Ridge Community Trust. The trust was made up of the 41 workers. They owned it collectively, legal and binding. But why did they leave it? Why didn't they stay and work the land? Because half of them were scared out of their minds. This was South Carolina in 1918. Mrs. Anderson, black folks didn't just take land from white folks and expect to live peaceful after. Most scattered within a week. Went north or west or just away. The ones who stayed tried to keep it going for a few years, but without resources, without credit, without anybody willing to trade with them or hire them. Shirley shook her head. It fell apart. The trust dissolved in 1967. Last member died. Property reverted to the county. Been bought and sold a few times since, but nobody ever lasted. Too much history in those walls. Rebecca's throat was tight. What about Eleanor? What happened to her? Shirley was quiet for a beat too long. My grandmother lost track of her after 1918. She thought Eleanor might have died, but she stood and crossed to a small desk in the corner, opened a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. About 15 years ago, I was going through my grandmother's things after she passed. Found this. It's a map, hand-drawn, shows where the gathering room is hidden. She handed the paper to Rebecca. The drawing was crude but detailed. A floor plan of Westfield's second floor. An X marked a spot behind the library, with a note, "Press the third shelf from top fifth book from left. Panel opens, stairs down." Rebecca stared at the map. "Your grandmother drew this?" "Drew it in 1962. Said she wanted someone to find that room someday, to see what they carved into the walls, to remember." Shirley sat back down. "Mrs. Anderson, those 41 people did something most folks never thought was possible. They looked their oppressors in the eye and said, 'No more,' without firing a shot. They organized, they documented, they risked everything, and they won. That room is their monument. Find it, honor it." Rebecca drove back to Westfield with the map clutched in her hand. The sun was setting, painting the house in shades of amber and rust. She grabbed her flashlight and went straight to the second floor. The library was in the east wing. Rebecca had passed through it before shelves empty, except for a few water-damaged books, windows, broken wallpaper, peeling away in long strips. Now she stood in front of the built-in bookshelf on the back wall and counted. Third shelf from top, fifth book from left. The book was a Bible leather cover, cracked and swollen. Rebecca pulled it. At first, nothing happened. Then she heard a click. The entire bookshelf shifted, swinging inward on hidden hinges to reveal a narrow opening. Cold air flowed out. Rebecca shined her flashlight into darkness. Stone steps led down into a basement level she hadn't known existed. The steps were steep and uneven. She descended carefully, one hand on the wall for balance. At the bottom, the space opened into a room larger than she expected, 15 feet by 20 feet, maybe more. The ceiling was low, supported by thick wooden beams. The walls were stone, mortared together roughly. No windows. One electric bulb hung from the ceiling, but Rebecca didn't trust the wiring. She swept her flashlight around the room, empty except for a few wooden crates stacked in one corner. Then her beam hit the far wall, and she stopped breathing. Names, carved into the stone, not scratched or etched lightly, but carved deep, each letter an inch tall, cut with painstaking care. Rebecca crossed the room and stood before the wall. 41 names arranged in rows. She found Eleanor's immediately third row, fourth name. Eleanor Mitchell. Next to it, Daniel Freeman. Below the names carved just as deeply, June 4th, 1918. And beneath that, in letters even larger, "We walked free." Rebecca traced the words with her fingertips. The stone was cold and rough. Each letter must have taken hours to carve. This wasn't done in a single night. This was days of work, weeks maybe, after the Harrisons left, after the victory. 41 people creating a permanent record of what they'd done. She read every name. Some she recognized from the census records. Others were new. All of them people who'd been written out of history, whose stories were buried or destroyed or simply forgotten. And they'd known that would happen, known that the official records would erase them, So they carved their own. Below the main inscription, Rebecca found more words carved in a different hand. Smaller letters, Harrison gone, /, workers remain. She stood in that underground room for a long time, flashlight beam playing over the names, trying to imagine that moment, the day after the Harrisons fled, the workers gathering here in this hidden space to mark what they'd accomplished, carving their names into stone so that even if everything else was taken from them, this would remain. Rebecca noticed the wooden crates in the corner again. She walked over and opened the first one. Inside were papers protected by a layer of oilcloth. She lifted the cloth carefully. Legal documents. She recognized the format from her hours at the church archive. Deed transfers, contracts, and on top, yellowed but perfectly preserved, a single sheet of paper with an official seal. Bill of Sale and Property Transfer, the heading read, from James R. Harrison to the Oak Ridge Community Trust. June 4th, 1918. Rebecca lifted it out. The paper was thick, expensive stock, the kind used for important documents. James Harrison's signature sat at the bottom, witnessed by a notary public, and two other names Rebecca didn't recognize. Next to Harrison's signature, sold for the sum of $1 and other valuable considerations. $1. He'd signed over 847 acres for $1. The document listed the trust members, all 41 names typed neatly, the same names carved into the wall, and next to each name, equal shareholder. They'd done it, actually done it, forced Harrison to transfer legal ownership, created a collective trust where every member had equal stake, and they'd made it official, notarized, legally binding. Rebecca sat down on the floor with the deed in her lap. This changed everything. If this document was real, and it looked real, felt real, had the right seals and signatures, then her great-grandmother hadn't just been part of a protest. She'd been part of a legal transfer of power. Eleanor Mitchell was an owner, a shareholder in the Oak Ridge Community Trust, which meant Rebecca's grandmother, Margaret Eleanor's daughter, was technically an heir, which meant Rebecca herself. She couldn't finish the thought. It was too big, too complicated, but the implications spun out in front of her like threads she was just beginning to see. The trust dissolved in 1967, property reverted to county ownership. But if there were still living heirs who'd never been notified, never had a chance to claim their inheritance. Rebecca shook her head. This wasn't about money or ownership. This was about truth, about knowing what her family had done, about understanding that she came from people who'd looked at injustice and organized against it, who'd risked everything for dignity and won. She carefully placed the deed back in the crate and opened the second box. More documents, letters written by Daniel Freeman to NAACP leadership, responses from lawyers offering advice, a ledger documenting every worker's unpaid wages going back to 1910, the evidence they'd compiled to force Harrison's hand. The third crate held something different. Photographs. Not the formal posed kind like the one Rebecca had found. These were candid. Workers in the fields, children playing near the cabins, a woman hanging laundry, a group of men sitting on a porch smoking and talking. Life documented by someone who'd cared enough to preserve it. Rebecca found a photograph of Eleanor. She stood next to an older woman, Ruth. Rebecca guessed Eleanor's mother in front of the big house. Eleanor looked directly at the camera, unsmiling, holding something in her arms, a baby. Rebecca turned the photo over. Someone had written on the back, Eleanor and baby Margaret, March 1918. Her throat closed. This was weeks before Eleanor sent the baby away. Weeks before the uprising. Eleanor holding her daughter, knowing what was coming, knowing she'd chosen to fight instead of run. What would make a mother give up her child? Not poverty alone, not fear alone, but the absolute certainty that staying and fighting was more important than running and surviving. That some battles were worth the sacrifice. That freedom, real freedom, earned freedom, was worth losing everything. Rebecca sat in the gathering room until her flashlight died and she had to navigate back up the stairs by touch. She emerged into the library as the last daylight faded from the windows. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from George White and 1 text, "Found something, come by tomorrow." That night Rebecca didn't sleep. She sat in the foyer with Eleanor's journal, the deed and the photographs spread around her, piecing together the story. Her great-grandmother had been 28 years old when she organized a peaceful uprising that transferred ownership of a plantation from white masters to black workers, had documented everything with the precision of someone who knew that truth needed evidence, had given up her daughter to save her from the life Eleanor herself had lived. And Eleanor had won. The victory hadn't lasted. The trust fell apart. The workers scattered. The property reverted to the county and eventually to strangers. But for a few years, from 1918 to the early 1920s, Westfield had been owned by the people who worked it. The carving on the wall said it all. We walked free. Rebecca thought about her grandmother Margaret, growing up in Seattle, believing her mother died in childbirth, never knowing that Eleanor had lived, had fought, had carved her name into stone. Margaret died in 1982, 58 years old. Same age Rebecca was now. Died not knowing she was the daughter of a revolutionary. As dawn broke over Westfield, Rebecca made a decision. This story was too important to keep buried. Eleanor had documented everything because she wanted it known. The gathering room existed as a monument waiting to be found. The carved names were a message sent forward through time. We were here. We mattered. We fought back. Rebecca would make sure that message was delivered. She pulled out her phone and called George White. He answered on the second ring, voice still rough with sleep. "Mrs. Anderson, it's 6 in the morning. I found it, the gathering room, the carved names, the deed, all of it." A pause. Then George's voice came back, sharp and alert. "You found the deed, the actual transfer document, notarized and signed, June 4th, 1918. James Harrison transferred Westfield to the Oak Ridge Community Trust for $1, 41 members, including my great-grandmother." "Sweet Lord," another pause. "Come to the church. Now, I found something last night you need to see." Rebecca drove to town as the sun rose, turning Oak Ridge's empty streets golden. George met her at the church entrance, still in his pajamas, under a cardigan holding a folder. "County death records," he said without preamble. "I stayed up searching after you left yesterday. I found Ruth Mitchell, died 1923 in Charleston. Natural causes. But Eleanor—" He opened the folder. "I couldn't find a death certificate. Not in South Carolina, not anywhere in the South. So I expanded the search." He pulled out a single sheet. "Death certificate. Eleanor Hayes Mitchell, died May 3rd, 1962, Oak Ridge, South Carolina." Rebecca stared at the paper. 1962. She was here. She lived here. Until she was 72 years old. Never left. The certificate lists her occupation as domestic worker, which tells me nothing. No next of kin listed. Buried in the colored section of Pinewood Cemetery, which is now called, George smiled slightly. Restful Gardens, Memorial Park. They integrated in 1975. Show me. They drove to the cemetery in George's old sedan. Restful Gardens sat 2 miles outside town, a rolling hill dotted with headstones from different eras. George led her to the older section where the stones were simple markers, many without names. Here. He stopped in front of a small granite marker flat to the ground, partially covered by grass. I came out yesterday after I found the certificate. Wanted to confirm. Rebecca knelt and pulled away the grass. The stone read Eleanor M., 1890 to 1962. Just initials, just dates. No beloved mother or cherished friend, just a woman's initials and the years she lived. Rebecca pressed her palm flat against the stone. The granite was cool and rough. Eleanor had lived 44 more years after the uprising. Stayed in Oak Ridge while everyone else scattered. Why? To protect the memory, to guard the gathering room, to make sure someone someday found what they'd carved into that wall. Your great-grandmother was a remarkable woman, George said quietly. Rebecca looked up at him, tears streaming down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. She gave up everything, her daughter, her chance to escape. And then she stayed here for 44 years in the place that had imprisoned her. Why would she do that? George knelt beside her. Maybe because she wanted to make sure the story survived. Maybe because leaving would have felt like admitting defeat. Or maybe he touched the headstone gently, because this was the only place she'd ever known. And after they won, after they walked free, it became hers in a way it never had been before. Not property, something deeper, the right to exist in it without permission. They stayed at the grave until the morning got too warm. Then Rebecca stood and looked out across the cemetery. Hundreds of markers, hundreds of stories, most of them lost or never told. Not this one, not Eleanor's, not any more. Rebecca pulled out her phone and took a picture of the headstone. Then she opened her notes app and started typing everything she'd learned, the letters, the journal, the gathering room, the carved names, the deed, the death certificate, evidence, documentation, the tools Eleanor herself had used. The past wasn't buried anymore. Rebecca had excavated it. And now she was going to make sure everyone knew what her great-grandmother had done. Rebecca spent 3 weeks turning Westfield from a ruin into something people could walk through without fearing the floors would give way. She hired a structural engineer from Charleston who whistled low when he saw the gathering room and said the foundation was actually solid, built better than the house above it. She brought in an electrician to run temporary lighting, a plumber to get one bathroom functional, the bare minimum to make the space safe. But the real work was genealogy. She started with the 41 names carved into the wall, cross-referenced them against census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, built family trees that branched and twisted, and sometimes dead-ended in unmarked graves, or simply vanished into silence. Some lines were easy to trace. Others required calls to churches in distant cities, emails to county clerks in states Eleanor's companions had fled to hours scrolling through digitized newspapers looking for obituaries or wedding announcements. Daniel Freeman's line led to Chicago. His grandson, Kenneth Freeman, was a retired postal worker, 73 years old. Rebecca called him on a Tuesday afternoon. "My grandfather never talked much about South Carolina." Kenneth's voice came through scratchy but clear. Said he left it behind for good reason, but he kept one thing, a photograph of names carved into a wall, kept it in his Bible until the day he died. Did he say what it meant? Only that it was the day his father became a free man, not freed. Free. There's a difference, he said. Kenneth was quiet for a moment. You telling me that wall still exists? I'm standing in front of it right now. The silence stretched so long, Rebecca thought the call had dropped. Then Kenneth's voice came back thick with emotion. I'll be there. Tell me when. She made 37 more calls like that. Some people hung up. Some thought it was a scam. But 19 families responded with variations of the same question. Can we see it? George helped her draft an invitation. Simple, straightforward. If you are descended from the 41 members of the Oak Ridge Community Trust, you are invited to gather at Westfield Estate on October 12, 2024, to witness the memorial your ancestors created. She mailed 67 invitations to addresses scattered across 15 states. 95 people confirmed they were coming. The developer letter arrived in week 4. Rebecca found it in her post office box, thick, cream-colored envelope with a Charlotte return address. Inside, a letter on law firm letterhead, Davidson and Associates. The language was polite but clear. Their client Hartwell Properties, LLC, was prepared to offer $200,000 for Westfield Estate. Cash. As is. Close in 30 days. The letter suggested this was a generous offer for a property in such severe disrepair. Rebecca looked up Hartwell Properties online. The LLC had been registered 6 months ago. The managing member was listed as Robert Hartwell, address in Atlanta. She showed the letter to George the next morning. Hartwell, he said, studying it. That's the name the Harrison family changed to in 1890. They went back to it, apparently. Descendant has to be. Probably great-nephew or some such. Been a few attempts over the years to reclaim the property. None went anywhere because the legal transfer was clean. George handed the letter back. But that was before someone started digging into the history, before descendants started gathering. If he's smart, he's worried you'll contest the county sale, make a claim based on the trust. Rebecca folded the letter and put it in her pocket. I'm not selling, and I'm not contesting. I just want people to know what happened here. You might want to put that in writing. Lawyers like clarity. She drafted a response that afternoon. 1 paragraph. Thank you for your offer. I decline. The property is being preserved as a historical memorial and is not for sale at any price. She mailed it certified. 2 weeks later, a different letter arrived. Same law firm, different tone. Their client disputed the current ownership structure and intended to file suit, claiming the 1918 transfer was made under duress and therefore invalid. They suggested Rebecca might want to retain counsel. George recommended Amanda Chen, a civil rights attorney in Columbia who'd handled several historical property disputes. Rebecca called and left a message. Amanda called back within an hour. I know about Westfield. Read the article the Observer ran last month. The article had been George's doing, a gentle leak to a reporter he knew. Nothing sensational, just the facts. If what you have is genuine and I'd need to see the documents, this is one of the most significant pieces of Reconstruction-era resistance history I've ever heard of. Rebecca scanned and emailed the deed, the letters, photographs of the carved wall. Amanda called back the same day. This is airtight. Legal transfer properly notarized, no evidence of coercion beyond the fact that Harrison chose to leave rather than face exposure, which isn't illegal duress, it's consequence. I'll file a response. The suit won't go anywhere. But, Mrs. Anderson, Amanda paused. This property could be worth a lot more than 200,000 if you developed it. You sure you want to turn it into a memorial? Rebecca looked around the gathering room where she'd started sleeping because it felt closer to Eleanor than the empty rooms above. I've never been more sure of anything. Amanda filed. The developer's lawyer responded with emotion. Amanda counterfiled. The legal dance continued in the background while Rebecca focused on what mattered, getting ready for October 12th. She cleared the overgrown drive, rented folding chairs, bought a tent in case of rain, made arrangements with Mabel's Diner to cater lunch, set up a microphone and speaker system borrowed from the Baptist church, printed copies of the photographs, created a booklet with the names from the wall and what she'd learned about each person. Shirley Allen came by most days, bringing food Rebecca forgot to eat, and stories her grandmother had told, details that filled in gaps. Small things Eleanor loved singing had a voice like honey. Daniel Freeman walked with a limp from a childhood injury, but never let it slow him down. Ruth Hayes Mitchell could calculate numbers in her head faster than anyone with pencil and paper. They were people, Shirley said one afternoon sitting on the porch steps while Rebecca sanded down a railing. That's what gets lost. They become symbols or victims or heroes, but they were just people who decided they'd had enough. People who got tired of living small and scared. Rebecca stopped sanding. My grandmother never knew any of this. She died thinking her mother abandoned her. Maybe that's what Eleanor wanted. Better to think you were abandoned than to know your mother stayed in hell by choice. Shirley picked at a splinter on the step. Some truths are too heavy for the people we love. We carry them so they don't have to. October 12th arrived with clear skies and temperature in the low 70s. Rebecca woke at dawn in the gathering room and climbed the stairs to find cars already pulling into the drive. She'd expected people to arrive around noon. It was barely 7. Kenneth Freeman got out of a rental car leaning heavy on a cane. A younger man his son Rebecca guessed helped him toward the house. Kenneth looked up at the columns, the peeling paint, the vines still clinging to the upper windows, despite Rebecca's attempts to clear them. My God, he said quietly, it's real. More cars came. A family from Virginia, great-great-grandchildren of Ruth Ann Washington, whose name was carved 5th from the left second row. An elderly woman from Tennessee who brought her own folding chair and a photograph of her grandfather standing in a cotton field. 2 sisters from Michigan whose grandmother had been Sarah Williams, beaten for breaking a plate blind in one eye the rest of her life. By 1195, people filled the yard, ages ranging from a girl of 7 to a man of 88 who'd driven himself from Florida. Most had never met. Some discovered they were cousins. The Michigan sisters found a third cousin they'd never known existed. Families that had scattered to opposite ends of the country reunited on the ground their ancestors had claimed briefly as their own. Rebecca stood on the porch and watched them. These weren't statistics. These were Eleanor's victory made flesh. 600 descendants from 41 people who'd refused to disappear. Proof that resistance worked, that dignity claimed could be passed down, that the past wasn't dead. It walked and talked and gathered in the South Carolina sun, asking to see what their people had carved into stone. George helped organize them into groups. 10 people at a time descended into the gathering room. Rebecca heard their reactions through the floorboards. Gasps, crying, long silences. One woman started singing, "We Shall Overcome," and the rest joined in voices rising through the house like prayer. When everyone had seen it, they gathered under the tent. Rebecca had planned to speak, had written notes, but Kenneth Freeman stood first, leaning on his cane. My grandfather Daniel told me once that a man isn't free until he's willing to lose everything for it. I thought he was talking about dying, but standing here now, seeing what they built, Kenneth's voice cracked. I understand he meant something different. They were willing to lose their safety, their certainty, their very lives, not for death, for the chance to live without asking permission. He sat down. Others stood. Shared stories passed down through generations. A great-granddaughter of Moses Lincoln talked about the quilts her family made, each pattern containing a piece of history stitched into fabric. A descendant of Rebecca Washington brought a ledger her ancestor had kept, documenting every instance of injustice in precise handwriting. Rebecca realized she was witnessing something rarer than history. This was inheritance, the passing of memory from those who lived it to those who would carry it forward. Eleanor and Daniel and the 39 others had carved their names expecting to be forgotten. Instead, they'd planted seeds that grew into a forest. As the sun began its descent, Rebecca finally stood. She'd left her notes inside. This needed to come from somewhere deeper than preparation. I bought this house thinking I was buying a project. Something to fill empty days after my husband died. Something to occupy hands that didn't know what to do anymore. She paused, finding the words. What I found was a woman I never knew existed. My great-grandmother, Eleanor, who carved her name into stone after doing something I still can't fully comprehend. She gave up her daughter, my grandmother, so that daughter could be free. Then she stayed here and fought for freedom herself, and won. Rebecca gestured toward the house. That woman lived 44 more years in this place. Never left, never ran. I don't know if she was happy. I don't know if she ever regretted staying, but I know she wanted this story told. Otherwise, she wouldn't have kept the journal, wouldn't have hidden the letters, wouldn't have carved those names where someone might find them. She pulled the music box from her bag. She'd brought it down that morning, polished it, until the mother-of-pearl inlay gleamed. This was Eleanor's. The melody it plays is the same one my grandmother hummed to me when I was small. Neither of us knew where it came from, but it came from here, from a woman who wanted her daughter to remember joy, even if she couldn't remember her mother. Rebecca wound the mechanism and opened the lid. The melody spilled out across the gathering, delicate and heartbreaking and impossibly sweet. An 86-year-old man in the back stood suddenly face wet with tears. That's the freedom song. My grandmother taught it to me, said it was older than memory, said Eleanor Mitchell taught it to the children before they scattered. His voice shook. I haven't heard it in 70 years. The melody played on. People began humming along, finding harmonies they didn't know they knew. The music seemed to pull memory from the ground itself, rising through the soles of their feet into their throats. This was the sound of inheritance, the proof that resistance didn't end when the fighters died. It echoed forward through every child who learned the song. When the music box wound down, the silence that followed was profound. Then the 7-year-old girl in the front row spoke up, voice clear and certain. What happens to the house now? Rebecca knelt so they were eye level. It becomes a place where people can come learn what your ancestors did, a school, kind of. But for history, that didn't make it into the books. Will you tell them the truth? Every word of it? The girl nodded, satisfied. Good. My teacher said the past is past. But it's not, is it? It's right here. Out of the mouths of children came the wisdom adults spent lifetimes trying to relearn. The past wasn't behind them. It was beneath their feet, carved into walls, passed down in songs and stories, and the shape of a jaw that echoed across generations. The past was present tense as long as someone remembered. As people began to leave, many approached Rebecca. Some brought documents to add to the collection. Letters, photographs, deeds from the brief years the trust operated. Others just wanted to touch the walls, to stand where their people had stood, to breathe air their ancestors had fought to claim. Kenneth Freeman was the last to leave. He stood in the gathering room one final time, hand pressed against his grandfather's carved name. "Thank you," he said simply, "for finding this, for not letting it stay buried. It found me." Rebecca stood beside him. "I think Eleanor wanted one of her own to know, so she made sure the breadcrumbs were there. The music box, the symbols, the initials, carved where I'd see them." "You will believe in that?" The past reaching out. Rebecca thought about it, the improbable chain of events that led her here, the auction she shouldn't have seen, the bid she shouldn't have placed, the exact sequence of discoveries that revealed Eleanor's story in the right order at the right pace so Rebecca could understand what she was inheriting. I believe some stories refuse to die. They wait, and when the right person comes along, they speak. She looked at the wall of names. Eleanor spent 44 years making sure this story could be told. I'm just the one who finally listened. After everyone left, after the rental company collected the chairs and the tent, after George helped her clean up the paper plates and plastic cups, Rebecca sat alone in the gathering room. The developer's lawsuit had been withdrawn that afternoon. Amanda called with the news. Apparently, Robert Hartwell's lawyer had seen the Observer article about the gathering and advised his client that pursuing the case would generate exactly the kind of publicity Hartwell wanted to avoid. "You won," Amanda said, "legally and publicly. The property is yours. The history is documented, and Hartwell Properties just issued a statement saying they respect the historical significance of the site and wish the memorial project well." Rebecca didn't feel victorious. She felt exhausted and sad and strangely peaceful all at once. This wasn't about winning. This was about witnessing, about standing in the space between past and present, and refusing to let the connection break. She stayed at Westfield through the winter, used the settlement money from David's life insurance to hire contractors who could do the work she couldn't. Roof repairs, foundation reinforcement, weatherproofing, not restoration to some imagined grandeur, but stabilization. Making sure the house would stand another 100 years. In February, she filed paperwork to establish Westfield Heritage Center as a 501c3 nonprofit. The mission statement took her 3 days to write. Every word mattered. To preserve and share the history of resistance, resilience, and self-determination demonstrated by the 41 members of the Oak Ridge Community Trust, and to honor all those who fought for freedom without the privilege of being remembered. The board of directors included George Shirley Kenneth Freeman and 2 other descendants who'd attended the October gathering. Rebecca took the title of executive director with a salary of $1 per year. The real funding came from grants. The State Historical Society contributed. The Southern Poverty Law Center gave $20,000. Small donations arrived from people who'd read about Westfield online. $10 here, $50 there. One elderly teacher in Ohio who sent $500 with a note that said simply, "For Eleanor." By spring, they had enough to install proper lighting in the gathering room, create a small museum space in two of the first-floor rooms, and hire a part-time educator to lead school tours. The carved wall was protected behind climate-controlled glass, but visible, touchable through the glass for descendants who wanted that connection. Rebecca moved into the servants' quarters Eleanor had once occupied. The small room felt right. She bought a narrow bed, a desk, a lamp, hung Eleanor's photograph on the wall, kept the music box on the bedside table, and wound it every night before sleep. She was 59 now, older than Eleanor had been when she organized the uprising, younger than Eleanor was when she died. Rebecca thought about that sometimes, how Eleanor had lived to 72 without ever seeing her daughter again, without knowing if Margaret was happy, or safe, or even alive. But Eleanor had known something else. She'd known that resistance was possible, that power could be confronted and defeated, that people who were told they were nothing could claim space and dignity and leave a mark so deep it couldn't be erased. That knowledge must have carried her through the long decades. That and the hope that someday someone would find what she'd left behind. The center opened to the public in June. The first visitor was a school group from Charleston, 23 eighth graders, studying Reconstruction. Their teacher, a young black woman named Jennifer, walked them through the gathering room and explained what they were seeing. The people who carved these names weren't presidents or generals or anyone history usually remembers. They were workers. Most couldn't read or write more than their names, but they organized, they documented, they used the law as a weapon against people who thought themselves above the law. And they won. Jennifer paused at Eleanor's name. This is what resistance looks like when it's smart instead of just angry, strategic instead of just desperate. One student raised her hand. Did they get to keep the land? No, they held it for a few years, but economic pressure and fear forced most to leave. The trust dissolved. The property reverted to public ownership and eventually private sale. So they lost. Did they? Jennifer gestured at the wall. We're standing here 106 years later reading their names, learning their story, seeing proof that they mattered. That's not losing. That's planting a seed that took a century to grow. Rebecca watched from the doorway, heart in her throat. This was what Eleanor had wanted. Not fame, not glory, just to be seen, to have her humanity acknowledged, to know that her life meant something beyond the suffering she endured. The students filed out eventually, but one girl lingered. She stood in front of the wall, reading every name slowly. You okay? Rebecca approached gently. The girl didn't look away from the wall. My great-great-grandfather's name was Freeman. My grandma says we're from South Carolina originally, but nobody knows where exactly. She pointed at Daniel's name. Could this be him? Rebecca's pulse quickened. What was his first name? She just called him Papa Freeman, but... The girl pulled out her phone, scrolled through photos. She has this picture. She held it up, a very old photograph, creased and faded. A man in his 70s standing in front of a house in what looked like Chicago, based on the architecture. But in his hands, he held a piece of paper with writing on it. Rebecca zoomed in. The paper showed a crude drawing of a wall, and on that wall, names. Can you send me that photo? Rebecca's voice came out unsteady. The girl nodded, typing Rebecca's email carefully. Do you think could he really be my grandfather? I think Daniel Freeman's grandson lives in Chicago and would very much like to meet you. Rebecca pulled out her own phone and called Kenneth. Kenneth, I have someone here you need to talk to. She handed the phone to the girl and stepped back, watched the teenager's face shift from uncertain to shocked to quietly joyful as Kenneth's voice came through, asking questions, making connections, confirming the impossible truth that families scattered by fear and economics could find each other across a century of silence. This was the work now, not just preserving history, but reuniting the threads it had torn apart. Every week brought new visitors. Some descended from the 41, some just interested in history, some looking for their own stories in the cracks of the official record. Rebecca turned 59 in September. No party, just her and George and Shirley sitting on the porch at sunset, drinking sweet tea and watching fireflies emerge from the tall grass. You ever think about what Eleanor would make of all this? Shirley gestured at the house lights glowing in the windows, a small crowd visible through the glass as the evening tour made its way through. Rebecca had thought about it constantly. I think she'd be surprised it took so long, but glad it happened at all. You've given her a voice. That's worth something. I didn't give her anything. I just stopped ignoring what she was trying to say. Rebecca set down her glass. All those years my grandmother was alive, Eleanor's story was right here waiting. If I'd been braver or more curious, or just, I don't know, more awake to the world, maybe I could have found it while Grandma Margaret was still alive. She could have known where she came from. George shook his head. Timing isn't something we control, Rebecca. You found it when you needed it, after David died, after you retired, when you had nothing but empty hours and a heart looking for purpose. That's not accident. That's grace. Maybe he was right. Maybe Rebecca had needed to be lost before she could find Eleanor. Needed to feel purposeless and invisible and forgotten before she could understand what those things meant to someone who'd lived them as reality instead of just emotion. The center operated on a shoestring budget and volunteer labor. Some weeks they had 40 visitors, some weeks they had 4, but every person who walked through left different than they arrived. Rebecca could see it in their faces, the way they touched the glass covering the carved wall, the quiet that settled over them in the gathering room, the questions they asked afterward, not about dates or mics, but about courage and fear and what it takes to stand up when the world tells you to bow down. As Rebecca stood in front of Eleanor's name one night, after closing, tracing the letters through the protective glass, she realized something she'd been too close to see. This wasn't Eleanor's story. Not anymore. It was everyone's story who'd ever been told they didn't matter. Every person written out of history or erased from memory, or simply deemed too insignificant to record. Eleanor had carved her name to say, I was here, I mattered, I refused to disappear, and now, 106 years later, Rebecca was making sure that refusal echoed forward, not just for Eleanor, for every person whose resistance went unrecorded, every act of defiance that history forgot, every moment of courage that deserved to be witnessed. You cannot bury truth forever. It grows roots. It pushes through concrete. It waits with the patience of stone for someone willing to excavate it. And when that person comes tired and lost, and looking for meaning in a life that suddenly feels small, truth offers itself as inheritance, as purpose, as proof that nothing is ever truly forgotten as long as one person chooses to remember. Rebecca wound the music box that night and let the melody fill the gathering room. The freedom song, Eleanor's song, passed down through generations of humming and half-remembered words until it found its way back to the house where it began. Some stories refuse to die, Rebecca thought. They just wait for someone brave enough to listen. And whether that bravery comes from strength or desperation or simple loneliness doesn't matter. What matters is showing up, opening the boxes, reading the letters, following the breadcrumbs a great-grandmother left because she knew somehow that her blood would return. Rebecca Anderson had bought a house to fill empty days. She'd found a legacy instead. And in finding it, she'd discovered that retirement wasn't an ending. 58 wasn't too late. Loss didn't mean life was over. Sometimes loss cleared space for something truer, something that mattered in ways a classroom full of students or a marriage bed or any of the roles she'd played could never quite reach. She was a witness now, a keeper of memory, a bridge between the dead and the living. And Eleanor, 72, when she died alone in a town that had tried to erase her, buried in a grave, marked only with initials, Eleanor had won after all, because her great-granddaughter stood in the room Eleanor had helped claim, wound the music box Eleanor had left behind, and told anyone who would listen. This woman mattered. This woman fought. This woman refused to disappear, and because of her neither will I.